It was supposed to be an ordinary evening. My boss, Mr. Raymond, had been in town for a business trip, and in an attempt to maintain a good rapport, I had invited him over for dinner. My husband, Daniel, had prepared a delicious meal, excited to host. He was a freelance artist who worked from home, spending his days sketching, painting, and occasionally selling commissioned works. He wasn't wealthy, but he was passionate about what he did, and to me, that meant more than any paycheck ever could. However, my boss was the type of person who measured success only in dollar signs. As soon as Mr. Raymond entered our modest home, I could sense his disapproval. He glanced around, his lips curling into a smirk. "Cozy place," he said, but the condescending tone in his voice didn't go unnoticed. Daniel, always the gracious host, welcomed him warmly, offering him a seat and serving the appetizers he had spent the entire afternoon preparing. Mr. Raymond took a bite and nodded, but I could tell something was brewing behind his smug expression. The conversation started light, but it didn't take long before he turned to Daniel and asked, "So, what do you do all day?" Daniel, ever the gentleman, responded with enthusiasm, explaining his work and passion for art. Mr. Raymond chuckled, shaking his head. "Must be nice," he muttered. "Living off your wife's salary, playing around with paint." I felt my stomach tighten. I looked at Daniel, but he simply smiled, trying to brush off the insult. I clenched my fists under the table. Mr. Raymond didn't stop there. He leaned back in his chair, sipping his wine as he continued his mockery. "You know, in my world, real men earn 6 figures. They don't sit around at home all day. If I were in your shoes, I'd feel pretty useless." His words were laced with malice, his smirk widening as he waited for a reaction. I could feel my blood boiling, but Daniel remained calm. "Success isn't just about money," he replied. "It's about doing what you love, and I love creating art." Mr. Raymond scoffed. "Yeah, but does it pay the bills? Or do you rely on your wife for that?" He turned to me and smirked. "I bet you work extra hard to make up for it, don't you?" I could no longer hold my anger. "Daniel contributes more to this household than you could ever imagine," I snapped. "He supports me emotionally. He takes care of everything at home, and his art is his passion. Not everyone defines success the way you do." But Mr. Raymond wasn't done. He chuckled, shaking his head. "It's just sad, really. A man should be the provider. I bet people pity you." Daniel exhaled sharply but remained composed. "People who measure a man's worth by his paycheck are the ones truly lacking," he said firmly. "I wouldn't trade my life for a soulless job that drains me just to impress people like you." Mr. Raymond let out an exaggerated laugh, his arrogance growing. But what happened next he never saw coming. Suddenly the doorbell rang. I frowned, not expecting any other guests. Daniel stood up and opened the door, revealing our neighbor, Mr. Collins, a well-respected entrepreneur who had made a fortune in the tech industry. "Hey, Daniel, I brought over that painting commission payment I owed you," Mr. Collins said, handing Daniel an envelope. "Your last piece was breathtaking. I've got more requests from my colleagues if you're up for it." Daniel took the envelope graciously. "Thank you, Mr. Collins. I appreciate your support." Mr. Raymond's smug expression faltered as he watched the interaction. Mr. Collins turned to him and smiled. "You must be a friend of Daniel's. You know, he's one of the most talented artists I've ever met. His work is in some of the biggest offices in the city." Mr. Raymond's jaw tightened. "Oh?" he muttered, suddenly uncertain. Mr. Collins continued, oblivious to the tension. "Daniel's pieces sell for thousands. I'm actually surprised he has time to entertain guests like you. His work is in high demand." I suppressed a grin as Mr. Raymond shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Daniel simply smiled, thanking Mr. Collins once again before he left. Turning back to Mr. Raymond, he calmly placed the envelope on the table. "I may not have a 6-figure salary in a corporate office, but I earn my living doing something I love, and I respect people who do the same." Mr. Raymond swallowed hard, looking down at his plate. He had nothing to say. A heavy silence hung in the air before he cleared his throat. "Well, I suppose I misjudged you." Daniel only nodded. "Success isn't about belittling others, Mr. Raymond. It's about being happy with what you do." The rest of the dinner was quiet, and when Mr. Raymond finally left, I couldn't help but smile. He had come into our home believing Daniel was a failure, but he left realizing just how wrong he was, and that was the best victory of all. The next morning, I arrived at work to find Mr. Raymond acting strangely. He wasn't his usual overconfident. Instead, he seemed distant, lost in thought. When I entered his office to drop off some reports, he looked up at me with an unreadable expression. "I owe you an apology," he finally admitted. I was taken aback. Mr. Raymond was not the type to apologize easily. "I misjudged Daniel," he continued. "I always believed that financial success was the only real measure of a man's worth, but last night made me question that." I remained silent, letting him process his thoughts. "I spent so much time chasing promotions, money, and status that I forgot what it meant to actually enjoy life," he confessed. "I saw how happy Daniel was, how passionate he was about his work, and I envied that." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Mr. Raymond, the man who always prided himself on his ruthless ambition, was admitting that he had been wrong. "I think I need to reevaluate some things in my life," he murmured. "Maybe success isn't just about money." Over the next few weeks, I noticed a change in Mr. Raymond. He was no longer as harsh or dismissive toward employees. He even started taking an interest in the creative projects within the company, something he had previously ignored. One afternoon, he called me into his office. "I've been thinking about what Daniel said," he began. "I want to sponsor a corporate art initiative, something to support local artists and bring creativity into the workplace." I was stunned. "That sounds amazing," I said. "Daniel would be thrilled." Mr. Raymond smiled, a genuine one this time. "Tell him to submit his work. I'd love to feature one of his pieces." Daniel's passion had done what I never thought possible, changed the heart of a man who once measured life by wealth alone. And in the end, that was the greatest triumph of all. Daniel submitted his best paintings, and soon one was chosen to be displayed in the company's headquarters. The impact was immediate. Employees stopped to admire it. Conversations about art filled the halls, and the office felt more alive. Mr. Raymond, once dismissive of artists, now spoke about creativity with newfound respect. One evening, Daniel and I stood in front of his framed artwork at the company's entrance. "I never needed his approval," Daniel said, smiling, "but it's nice to see people appreciate what I do." I squeezed his hand, knowing that in the end, true success had found its way to where it belonged.